This is the brief on the history and lasting relevance of the English Revolution. Right? So we're looking at stuff that totally dismantles that comforting myth, the one about Britain being this moderate place that only changes through slow reforms. Turns out its revolutionary past was pretty violent, and that might explain why the ruling class still gets nervous about it. First, modern British democracy wasn't born out of compromise. It came from a violent revolution, a really bloody civil war between 1642 and 49 that literally ended with the king losing his head. Now, later historians kind of tried to sweep this under the rug, but the current crisis in Britain is forcing us to re-examine what actually went down back then. Second, the key figure here was Oliver Cromwell. He's described as the standout leader of this whole bourgeois revolution in the 1640s. And look, the analysis suggests that without his sheer determination, the revolution probably would have been betrayed pretty quickly by the big shots who initially backed it. He's even been called the Lenin of the English bourgeois revolution. That gives you an idea of his role. Finally, even after Cromwell grabbed power, the fight for the revolution's ideals wasn't over. You had the Levelers, a movement basically saying Cromwell was betraying the cause. They actually decided to fight him. It ended tragically, though, with 3 leaders executed on Cromwell's orders in 1649. It really highlights the deep social struggle that was going on, and why the memory of 1642 to 49 is still so potent. In short, the English Revolution is this essential, often violent historical reference point for understanding today's turbulence and social conflicts.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into something really quite fundamental about Britain. It's this widely held idea, this cultural narrative, that Britain is inherently moderate. You know the story, unlike those supposedly fiery Spaniards or the famously revolutionary French, the British are meant to be these pleasant, compromising people, preferring gentle reforms, small steps. Revolution, oh no, that could never happen in that green and pleasant land. That's the comforting myth we're looking at.
Right, it's a very persistent image. But the sources we've gathered for today, they really challenge that head on. They focus on the 17th century, the period of the English Revolution, or, as it's often more tamely called, the English Civil War.
And these sources argue that this whole notion of quiet, non-revolutionary Britain is basically, a carefully constructed illusion.
Exactly. A comforting myth, as you said. And the sources are pretty blunt about it. They state that modern British democracy wasn't born from quiet chats and gradual change. It was actually, quote, born out of a violent revolution that cut off the king's head and a bloody civil war.
Cutting off the king's head. I mean, that's about as far from moderate compromise as you can possibly get, isn't it? Regicide is radical.
It really is. It shatters the whole foundation of the old order.
So why dig this up now? What makes this old history suddenly so relevant?
Well, the sources suggest it's because the present situation in Britain, the political turbulence, the economic strains, the constitutional questions, it's all making those old certainties wobble. They say the present crisis in Britain has upset all the old comforting illusions.
So the present chaos makes looking back at past chaos almost unavoidable.
That seems to be the argument. The 17th century becomes an obligatory point of reference again. And what's fascinating here, according to these sources, is how the current establishment relates to this past, or rather, how they fear it. The argument is that the ruling class looks ahead with, frankly, dread, because they're haunted by the ghosts of 1642-49.
Ghosts that have never been properly dealt with.
Exactly. Never been completely exorcised, is the phrase used. It implies this deep, lingering anxiety in the corridors of power, maybe losing sleep over the possibility of history repeating in some form.
So our mission then, for you listening, based on these sources, it's about rediscovering this history that's been deliberately obscured.
Precisely. The sources point us towards Leon Trotsky, actually, writing way back in 1925. He argued that the British bourgeoisie, the ruling class, essentially has erased the very memory of the 17th century revolution.
Erased it how?
By, quote, dissolving its past in gradualness. That's the key mechanism, isn't it?
Dissolving it in gradualness.
Yep.
Smoothing out the rough edges.
Exactly. Making this violent rupture look like a smooth, almost natural evolution. Downplaying the conflict, the class struggle, the radical demands.
So Trotsky's point was that people, especially working people, need to actively dig that history up again.
Yes. He said workers must rediscover the English Revolution and find within its ecclesiastical shell the mighty struggle of social forces.
That ecclesiastical shell, meaning peel back the arguments about religion, about Puritans versus Anglicans.
And see the raw social and economic forces underneath, the class interests driving the conflict. That's what we're going to try and do today.
Okay, let's start that digging. Section 1. The world turned upside down, the violent birth of modern Britain. So the English Revolution, culminating 1642 to 1649. Let's be clear. This wasn't just a parliamentary debate gone wrong.
No, not at all. We're talking about a period of intense social upheaval, actual civil war, and the human cost was immense. Some estimates suggest, proportionally, it might have been deadlier for the English population than World War I was centuries later.
Wow. That really puts it in perspective. So who are the main players?
Well, crudely put, you had King Charles I, a firm believer in the divine right of kings, answerable only to God, not Parliament.
Right.
Pitted against a Parliament increasingly influenced by, well, what the sources call the rising bourgeoisie.
Okay, that term, bourgeois revolution, it's pretty central to this analysis, isn't it? What does it mean in this context?
It means seeing the conflict as more than just king versus parliament or religious differences. It's about economics, fundamentally. You had this emerging class merchants, commercial farmers, early financiers whose ambitions were being blocked by the old feudal system.
Clock tower.
Things like the king levying taxes without parliament's okay, royal monopolies restricting trade, controls over land use.
Yeah.
It all kind of hampered the development of what we now call capitalism.
So the Civil War, in this view, was the necessary explosion to break those old structures.
Pretty much, to create a state that would protect and promote these new commercial interests and property relations.
And the ultimate proof that this wasn't moderate.
The execution of Charles I in January 1649, regicide. You can't get more radical than executing your divinely appointed monarch. It fundamentally shifts the basis of sovereignty.
Okay, so who leads this radical charge? The sources seem to zero in on one figure. Oliver Cromwell.
Yes, Cromwell is presented as the outstanding leader of the English bourgeois revolution, and the analysis really digs into why he was so crucial.
And there's that very provocative comparison the sources mention.
Yes, the comparison of Cromwell to Lenin, describing Cromwell as the Lenin of the English bourgeois revolution.
Which sounds jarring initially. A 17th century Puritan general and a 20th century communist leader.
It does. And the sources stress, it's not about comparing their specific ideologies point by point. It's about their historical function in a revolutionary situation.
Okay, so what was that function for Cromwell, according to this view? How did he stop the revolution being sort of watered down?
The argument is that Cromwell's leadership, his sheer determination, was essential. Without his steadfast courage and determination, the sources say, the revolution would have been betrayed by the big bourgeoisie.
The big bourgeoisie, meaning the wealthier elements within the parliamentary side.
Exactly. The richer merchants, the landed gentry, who were initially part of the opposition to the king. Many of them didn't actually want to go that far.
They didn't want to execute the king.
Many didn't. They were constantly seeking an accommodation with the crown. They wanted a deal, maybe a constitutional monarchy that secured their property and lowered taxes, but they were afraid of the radicalism unleashed by the war, afraid of, the common people getting too many ideas.
But Cromwell wasn't afraid.
Apparently not. As leader of the new model army, which was a formidable, ideologically motivated force, not just mercenaries, Cromwell represented the more determined revolutionary wing. He pushed things forward. He oversaw the purge of Parliament Pride's purge, getting rid of MPs who wanted compromise, and ultimately he signed the king's death warrant.
So he forced the pace, ensured the revolution didn't stop halfway.
That's the essence of the comparison. Just as, in this view, Lenin pushed the Russian Revolution past the moderate stage, Cromwell ensured the English Revolution achieved a fundamental break with the past, clearing the way for the new economic order.
That framing really does shift the focus, doesn't it? From a simple political fight to an internal class struggle within the revolution itself.
It does. The most radical elements, led by Cromwell, had to overcome the compromising tendencies of the wealthier group who started the fight but got cold feet. It highlights the internal conflicts, the opposite of smooth gradualness.
And this kind of intense conflict, this potential for radical upheaval, it wasn't new even in 1642, was it? The sources point further back?
Absolutely. You have to look at the gunpowder plot in 1605.
Guy Fawkes, we remember the 5th of November? Bonfires, fireworks?
Yeah, but we often forget the sheer scale of what was planned. This wasn't just, a protest. It was an attempt at total decapitation of the state.
Blowing up the House of Lords during the state opening.
Yes, killing King James I, the royal family, almost the entire political and religious establishment in one go.
And the aim.
To trigger a Catholic uprising against the Protestant monarchy. Complete regime change through mass assassination and insurrection.
So decades before the Civil War even started, you had these deeply radical plots aiming for violent overthrow.
Exactly. It shows the state was already seen as vulnerable and that extreme measures were conceivable. It undermines that narrative of inherent stability and moderation. The political stakes were incredibly high, right from the start of the century.
Okay, so the revolution happens, the king is executed, Cromwell ensures it isn't betrayed by compromisers. But then what? Surely things settled down into the new Commonwealth.
Well, this is where, as you said earlier, it gets really interesting. Section 2, Revolution Betrayed, because the fight wasn't over. Now the conflict turned inwards, within the victorious revolutionary side.
Divisions among the winners.
Deep divisions. And this brings us to the Levelers, a truly fascinating and radical movement.
Who were they exactly?
They're primarily based in the new model army itself, soldiers, junior officers, but also among artisans and tradespeople in London. They weren't just arguing about religion, they had a clear political, even democratic agenda.
And they felt the revolution, as led by Cromwell and the grandees, the senior officers and parliamentarians, wasn't fulfilling its promise.
Precisely. They believed the Civil War had been fought for certain ideals of liberty and equality, that were now being ignored or actively betrayed by the new leadership.
What kind of ideals? What were they actually demanding?
Their demands were incredibly radical for the 17th century. They laid them out in documents like the Agreement of the People. They wanted things like frequent parliaments, equality before the law for everyone, no imprisonment for debt, freedom of religion, abolition of tithes.
And crucially, the vote.
Yes, that was a huge one. They argued for a massive expansion of suffrage, basically. Votes for most adult men, except maybe servants and beggars. This was revolutionary stuff.
Because Cromwell and the grandees definitely didn't want that.
Absolutely not. Their vision was for a republic run by men of property. They feared that giving the vote to the poor, the property-less majority, would lead to chaos and attacks on private property.
You can really see this clash of ideas in those famous Putney debates, can't you?
Oh, definitely. Putney, in 1647. It's where the split became crystal clear. You had Colonel Rainsborough, a leveler leader, making that incredible statement.
Remind us.
He said, "I think that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live, as the greatest he, and therefore truly, sir, I think it's clear, that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government," basically arguing for consent and representation for all.
And the response from the other side? From Cromwell's son-in-law, Ireton?
Ireton's response was pure property defense. He argued that voting rights had to be linked to having a permanent fixed interest in the kingdom, meaning land or significant wealth.
Why? What was his fear?
He explicitly feared that if you gave poor men the vote, they'd just vote to take away the property of the rich. It was a fundamental clash. Popular democracy versus the rule of the propertied elite.
So, after the king's execution in 49, Cromwell holds power, but he's got this radical democratic element within his own army. A problem for him.
A huge problem. The Levelers didn't just debate. They started to organize, even mutiny within army regiments in 1649, feeling Cromwell was betraying the cause they'd fought for.
And Cromwell's response? Was it negotiation? Compromise?
No. It was swift and brutal suppression. The sources are very clear on this. He personally led forces to crush the Leveler mutinies in May 1649. Their last real stand was broken.
And then came the final act of suppression.
Yes, the execution of the Leveler leaders. On May 17, 1649, in Burford Churchyard, Oxfordshire, 3 leaders withstood against the church wall and shot.
By firing squad.
Yes, on Oliver Cromwell's direct orders. These were men who had fought alongside him against the king, now executed by him for demanding deeper democracy.
Wow. That is stark. It really drives home the point the sources make, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It shows that revolutions can devour their own. That the leadership, once in power, might turn against the very forces that brought them there, especially the more radical elements, to consolidate their version of the new order.
Cromwell, the revolutionary leader, becomes the enforcer against further revolution.
Precisely. He needed to secure the gains for the bourgeois class he represented, and the Levelers' demands threatened that stability, threatened property. So they had to be eliminated.
So much for a unified march towards democracy. It was born in conflict, and its radical wing was immediately and violently suppressed. This just completely shreds the gradualness narrative.
Utterly. It shows a foundation built not just on external violence against the monarchy, but internal violence against popular democratic movements.
Okay, so regicide, then suppression of radicals. What happens next in terms of building the state? Section 3. the aftermath and consolidation.
Well, after all that turmoil, civil war, Commonwealth under Cromwell, then the restoration of the monarchy, then another revolution, the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, which finally established parliamentary supremacy, the ruling elite craved stability.
Understandable, I suppose. Bad for business, all that upheaval.
Exactly. And one key piece of state building aimed at securing that stability was the Act of Union in 1707, merging the parliaments of England and Scotland.
Why was uniting with Scotland seen as necessary then to consolidate the gains from the English Revolution, essentially?
Several reasons, mostly boiling down to security, both political and economic. A big one was the succession question.
Right. Who would be monarch after Queen Anne?
Yes. England had chosen the Protestant Hanoverian line from Germany to prevent a Catholic Stuart restoration. But Scotland, theoretically, could still choose its own monarch.
Potentially bringing back the Stuarts and causing huge instability?
Precisely. The Union removed that threat by creating one parliament in Westminster, deciding for both kingdoms. Plus, there were economic factors.
Such as?
Scotland's elite had been financially ruined by the failed Darien colonial scheme. The Union offered them access to England's growing colonial trade network, and crucially, England basically paid off Scotland's national debt.
So a political solution driven by security concerns and, frankly, some financial incentives for the Scottish elite.
That's how the sources tend to frame it. A pragmatic consolidation of power, centralizing control in Westminster, ensuring the stability needed for commerce, and the new constitutional settlement to flourish.
And this union wasn't universally popular, but it got through the Scottish Parliament.
It did. The vote in January 1707 was 110 in favor, 67 against, ratifying the treaty. It became law a few months later.
But the sources imply this was achieved through pressure and those economic sweeteners, perhaps against the will of many ordinary Scots.
Yes, there was significant popular opposition. But the act passed, creating Great Britain and cementing that centralized state structure, which was seen as the necessary outcome of the turbulent 17th century. No more threats from internal radicals like the Levelers or external dynastic claims via Scotland.
Okay, so the trajectory is clear. Violent revolution, internal betrayal and suppression, then state consolidation for stability and commerce. A history steeped in conflict. Which brings us back to the big question.
Why the myth? Why the relentless focus on moderation? Section 4. The fear of the past.
If the history is so clearly violent and contested, why bury it?
The sources argue it's straightforward. Fear. The ruling class, they claim, actively seeks to bury this past under layers of falsehood because they genuinely fear the nation's revolutionary past.
Fear that remembering it might inspire people today.
Exactly. Fear that people might realize radical, fundamental change isn't alien to Britain. It's actually part of its foundation. And that's a dangerous thought for those invested in the status quo.
Especially now with all the current uncertainty.
Yes, the sources suggest the current turbulence makes the establishment even more anxious. They really don't want people drawing parallels or getting ideas from the 1640s.
So it all comes back to Trotsky's point about dissolving the past in gradualness.
Precisely. It's the perfect ideological tool. Constantly talk about compromise, evolution, common sense, the British way, and you slowly erase the memory of the regicide, the levelers, the sheer violence and class struggle involved.
You make the revolution seem like an anomaly or just a slightly messy step towards the correct moderate path.
You do. You neuter its radical potential. You create this narrative that says, we don't do that sort of thing here, which serves to limit political imagination today.
Which leads to the final point from the sources, the call to action for the listener.
Yes, they're quite explicit. They say, a careful study of the English Revolution is obligatory for every class-conscious worker. Not just for historians, but for anyone wanting to understand power and change.
Obligatory why? To see through the myth.
To see through the myth and, as Trotsky put it, to rediscover the real forces at play beneath the ecclesiastical shell, to understand the class interests, the struggle for power, and the potential for radical transformation that the official history tries to hide.
It's about reclaiming a hidden heritage, in a way.
Yes, reclaiming the memory of popular struggle, of figures like the Levelers, understanding the execution of the king, not just as a historical fact, but as a revolutionary act with deep social roots. The sources imply this knowledge is empowering, because if the establishment worked so hard to make people forget this history, there must be something potent in remembering it.
So, thinking about this for you listening today, if the very founding of modern Britain involved this level of violence and radicalism, but the national story is all about avoiding extremes, How does that tension play out now?
Does it make it harder to imagine or demand fundamental change today? Because we're constantly told that's not how we do things.
This deep dive really suggests that historical narratives aren't just neutral accounts. They're tools. They shape how we see the present and what we believe is possible for the future.
And the myth of British moderation looks very much like a political tool designed to manage expectations and, ultimately, manage the fear of repeating the upheavals of the 17th century. Keep those ghosts locked away.
Okay, let's do a quick recap then. We've looked at sources arguing that modern Britain wasn't born gradually, but through violent revolution, including executing a king.
We discussed Oliver Cromwell, controversially tagged the Lenin of this bourgeois revelation, seen as essential to push past compromising elites.
We highlighted the immediate bloody suppression of radicals like the Levelers, shot on Cromwell's orders for demanding too much democracy.
Then the consolidation of the state, through things like the Act of Union, prioritizing stability for the new commercial order.
And finally, how this entire turbulent radical history got systematically buried under the comforting myth of gradualness.
And the core takeaway from all this source material really is that intense social conflict, even violent revolution, isn't alien to nations often seen as moderate. It can be foundational. Understanding history means consciously separating that comforting myth from the often messy, violent, mighty struggle of social forces that actually drives change. The fact that rulers still seem to fear this history suggests its power hasn't faded.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to consider.
If the memory of the 17th century revolution, a cornerstone event, could be so effectively reshaped, smoothed over, dissolved into gradualness, what other major historical conflicts or transformations might have been similarly repackaged?
Think about other moments in modern democratic history. Are there other uncomfortable truths, other struggles perhaps based on class or race or region that have been deliberately obscured to maintain an illusion of peaceful, stable progress?
What other historical ghosts might be rattling their chains, potentially depriving rulers of sleep, precisely because their true stories hold lessons for today? Something to mull over.
Okay, so this critique looks at a really interesting collection of essays, media, all focused on the English Revolution. It argues, quite powerfully, that modern British democracy wasn't gradual, it was born in violence, and that this revolutionary past is deliberately buried.
Right. A deliberate forgetting?
Exactly. And the material makes a strong case for why workers today need to grapple with this history. Let's dive straight in, look at how we can maybe sharpen the impact even further.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
Well, a really dominant theme, maybe the main thread running through it all, is this direct challenge, to the idea that revolution just isn't British.
Yeah, that it never happened here.
Right.
Okay, so the first major point, to really maximize the impact, especially for an audience that's already quite knowledgeable, the core thesis, this provocative idea, needs to be synthesized and stated powerfully, once, up front, rather than repeated across all the different pieces.
Ah, so less repetition.
Precisely. The weakness structurally comes from the format, doesn't it? You've got different pieces, different dates.
Videos, essays, intros. Yeah.
And each one tends to restate the basic premise, the myth of gradualism versus the stark reality of the king losing his head, which is powerful the first time.
But gets less shocking with each repeat?
Exactly. For someone engaging with the whole collection, it starts to feel a bit like Groundhog Day. It dulls that initial crucial shock value.
Okay, I see the issue. So what's the fix?
Well, the suggestion is to sort of reorient the whole approach. Assume the reader or the listener gets the main point, the myth-busting, pretty quickly. Accept it as the baseline.
Right. Assume they're on board with the basic fact of the revolution.
Yes, and then pivot immediately to deepening the analysis. Structure it so each part builds, adds a new layer, offers more analytical depth, instead of just resetting the stage every time.
Makes sense. Got any concrete examples of how that might look?
Sure. Instead of painstakingly debunking the gradualism myth in every introduction, you could say kick off the main argument using that Leon Trotsky quote from 1925, the one about the bourgeoisie deliberately erasing the memory.
Ah, use the amnesia as the starting point, not the conclusion.
Exactly. Make that the premise. And from there, jump straight into the complex stuff. Maybe the last stand of the Levelers, or that comparison between Cromwell and Lenin you mentioned. Make those the focus, the real engagement points.
Okay, I hear that on efficiency, but let me push back a little. If we cut all the repetition, do we risk losing someone who maybe only knows the standard, comfortable Whig version of history? Don't they need that initial shock emphasized a bit? How do we balance getting to the meat with, making sure everyone's with us?
That's a fair point. It's about how you structure the collection as a whole, not necessarily gutting every intro. The first piece can set the stage forcefully.
Okay.
But after that, you trust the reader is initiated. By using something like the Trotsky quote early on, you're still acknowledging the cover-up, the ideological battle.
Right. You're saying, know they hide this.
Now let's analyze why and how and what the real consequences were.
It signals a higher level of analysis straight away. It says, this isn't just History 101. We're digging deeper here, into the class dynamics.
Okay, I'm starting to see it. It's about confidence in the core argument. Stop preamble, get to the analysis, treat the revolution itself as the established fact we're building from.
Precisely.
Right. So, moving on from structure. You mentioned Cromwell. The material definitely paints him as, well, the key figure preventing the revolution's betrayal by the more cautious elements, right? The big bourgeoisie wanting deals with the crown. Yes, it makes a strong case for his decisive leadership in that phase. But that brings us to the second point. To really cement the argument that this was a bourgeois revolution in the full sense, the material needs to tackle more directly how that new power structure actually got consolidated after the radical peak of the 1640s.
What happened next?
Exactly. There's a bit of a weakness in the timeline. It focuses intensely, powerfully on 1642 to 1649. The war, the execution.
The real drama.
Right. And then, analytically, it seems to jump quite far ahead, often mentioning the Act of Union in 1707 as a later consequence.
Leaving a gap in between.
A pretty significant one. Yeah, both chronologically and analytically. It leaves you wondering, okay, how did the class that won the war actually secure its victory? How did they build the institutions that underpin this modern British democracy you're talking about? We need to see that transition from victory to, well, governance.
Yeah, I can see how skipping that makes the later gradualist myth feel like it just popped up randomly rather than being a result of how things settled down.
Precisely. So the suggestion here is to consciously incorporate that consolidation phase. Sometimes called the counter-revolution, though maybe consolidation fits better here.
The period after the levelers are crushed, after Cromwell's gone.
Yes, that period is critical. It explains the political realities, how the gains were locked in. It provides the context for why the gradualist myth could eventually take hold. You need to show the, frankly, often messy business of turning a radical win into a stable-ish state structure.
Okay, so how do we do that concretely?
Well, one key thing would be to explicitly discuss the restoration in 1660, but frame it differently.
Not just as the king coming back?
No, not as a failure of the revolution, but as a mechanism, a way for the property-owning classes, the ones who now held the real power, aligned with Parliament, to maintain their fundamental economic and political dominance, while restoring the monarchy superficially.
So the crown comes back, but on Parliament's terms, essentially.
On the terms of the classes represented in Parliament, yes. It shows how the 1640s fundamentally altered the state's relationship to class power, paving the way for capitalism's growth. It strengthens the claim that it was a decisive bourgeois victory, even if the political form eventually looked like a compromise. Their core interests were secured.
That framing, the restoration as a tactical move by the victorious class, not just a royalist comeback. That's quite a sharp take. But, doesn't focusing on that consolidation period, the deals, the compromises, risk, diluting the radicalism? Making the new model army, the levelers, seem less revolutionary in the end?
I don't think so. Actually, I think it does the opposite. It confirms just how deep the revolution went.
How so?
Because if you only focus on the 1640s drama, it can feel like this amazing, fiery event that ultimately fizzled out or failed. By showing the lasting changes, how the state structure was permanently altered, how the relationship between crown, parliament, and property was fundamentally reset, you prove the victory was profound and enduring.
So the consolidation proves the initial break was real and deep.
Exactly. The key lesson isn't just they chopped off the king's head. It's about who took power and how they embedded that power institutionally, even through seemingly conservative means like the Restoration Settlement. proving that process is crucial to your whole argument about the bourgeois roots of the modern state.
Right, right. I'm sold. That shift from just the event to the whole process of consolidation, that feels much stronger analytically. It explains the long-term shift in class power, the transition from fighting force to ruling class.
Which is often where the ideological lines get drawn, isn't it?
Absolutely. Which brings us neatly to the present-day relevance. The material strongly argues we're in a really turbulent time now, and that the ruling class is still haunted by the ghosts of 1642-49, losing sleep over the fear of revolution.
It makes that link, yes. But here's the third point. The connection drawn between that 17th century struggle and the present crisis in Britain needs to be much more grounded in specific, concrete, contemporary analogies that really hit home for today's class-conscious worker.
So the link is there, but it's maybe too abstract?
A little, yeah. The weakness is that while stating things are turbulent and rulers are scared is a strong opening.
It doesn't quite show how.
Exactly. It lacks concrete examples showing how the specific dynamics of the 1640s, like the Levelers versus Cromwell, for instance, are actually playing out now, mirrored in today's political landscape. Without that, the history feels, well, historical, important maybe, but not tactically urgent. It reduces the significance for action.
Okay, so it needs more direct application? How do we make that happen?
The suggestion is to use the history quite explicitly as an analytical tool for diagnosing current conflicts. Move beyond just saying it's turbulent and highlight specific parallels, state actions, economic policies, how radical movements are handled today. The reader needs to see the 17th century not just as background, but as a kind of blueprint for understanding today.
Turn history into a tactical guide. That's a strong way to put it, but how do we make those comparisons concrete without it feeling forced or, historically clumsy?
Well, you can use the most powerful analogy you've already developed in the material, the idea of betrayal.
Ah, the Levelers feeling betrayed by Cromwell and the army grandees.
Precisely. Instead of just generalized fear of revolution, draw a really sharp parallel between that struggle, the Levelers fighting for, the revolution's promises against the consolidating powers, and specific recent examples, times when modern movements or workers' groups felt let down, sold out, undercut by mainstream parties or even established union leaderships.
So use the Levelers' experience as a template for analyzing modern political disillusionment?
Exactly. Their fight for popular sovereignty against the emerging bourgeois state is a near-perfect mirror for the frustration radicals feel today when their leaders compromise or sideline their demands. It speaks directly to that tension between revolutionary energy and establishment consolidation.
That feels much more specific, much more usable.
Another angle. Take the concept of the state, which the material discusses theoretically. Show it in action today. Use specific, modern examples, maybe new anti-protest laws, or how the state intervenes in strikes, and show how the methods used to maintain the current power structure echo the suppression tactics seen after 1649. That makes the history immediate. The structures of power and repression become recognizable across centuries.
I really like that specificity. Using the Levelers not just as a historical tragedy, but as a diagnostic tool for today. It shifts the history from something you learn about to something you use to analyze the present. It forces you to look at, say, the Labor Party or trade union bureaucracy and ask, where's the modern equivalent of Cromwell's betrayal happening right now?
Exactly. It makes the history tactical.
Okay, this has been really useful. A powerful collection, no doubt, but these points could definitely elevate it. So just to recap quickly, first, synthesize that core thesis early on, cut the repetition, assume the audience is ready for deep analysis.
Right. Get straight to the complex arguments. Second, broaden the historical scope. Don't jump from 1649 to 1707. Really dig into that crucial consolidation phase, especially reframing the Restoration as part of the bourgeois class solidifying its win.
Got it. And finally, sharpen those contemporary links. Make them specific, concrete, tactical. Use parallels like the Leveler betrayal as analytical tools for understanding the present crisis, not just mentioning general turbulence.
That's the essence of it. We focused on strengthening the structure, making sure the deep expertise already there really shines by moving past the initial myth-busting into the core analytical meat much faster.
Excellent.
We really encourage you to work through these suggestions, maybe restructure the flow of the collection, and definitely send the revised material back to us. We'd be very interested to see how it develops.
Will do. Thanks. This was incredibly helpful.
Welcome to The Debate. Our discussion today, well, it centers on one of the most violent, pivotal, and continuously reinterpreted periods in British history, the mid-17th century conflict. Our source material highlights this era, encompassing the 1640s and beyond, as the necessary bloody foundation for modern British parliamentary supremacy. But how should we really interpret this seismic shift?
That's right. The interpretive challenge is immense. Many contemporary historians prefer the broader term Wars of the Three Kingdoms, moving beyond an English-centric view. But the traditional debate remains centered on the nature of the conflict within England itself. So the core question is, does historical analysis benefit most from labeling the 1642 to 1649 conflict the English Revolution, emphasizing a fundamental, transformative social and economic struggle? Or is it more accurately designated the English Civil War, focusing primarily on the political and, the ecclesiastical, the church-related aspects?
Look, I maintain this was a violent, decisive revolution. It fundamentally changed the state. This was an upheaval that saw not just a change of ruler, but the actual abolition of the monarchy, the abolition of the House of Lords, and of course the ultimate transgression, the cutting off of the king's head. I mean, if that isn't revolution, what is?
I come at it from a different way. While I fully acknowledge the sheer violence and the profound political results, the king's execution being a world historical moment, no doubt, I believe labeling the entire event as the revolution risks imposing a predetermined, almost theoretical framework on the outcome. It sort of suggests a singular, successful progression toward a goal, and in doing so, I think it seriously underplays the swift political maneuvering that, curtailed the aspirations of the true radical elements.
Okay, let's delve into that underlying framework, because its clarity is precisely what makes the term revolution essential, in my view. This was not merely some, family dispute between factions. It was the mechanism through which the foundations of a new economic and political order were secured. We are talking specifically about the English bourgeois revolution of the 1640s. I see the source material drawing on some powerful historical analysis when it discusses the true forces at play. As Leon Trotsky noted nearly a century ago, the core conflict often hides behind religious or political disputes. He argued that we must rediscover the English Revolution and find within its ecclesiastical shell the mighty struggle of social forces.
Right. That is a critical point that needs unpacking a bit. When you refer to the ecclesiastical shell, you mean that the fighting over church structure, Puritan versus Anglican, was the public face, the sort of legalistic justification for what was actually a deeper economic conflict? Is that the idea?
Precisely. The fight over who prays how was the shell, you could say, that masked the real movement of power. The shift from the old feudal and royal interests toward the rising classes, the gentry, the merchants, the new landowners. That economic class, the nascent bourgeoisie, needed political institutions like a supreme parliament that secured property rights and favored trade over, hereditary privilege. That fundamental restructuring is what makes it a revolution.
That's a compelling argument for the structural drivers, certainly. But let me offer a contrasting view based more on the immediate outcome. While the violence of the bloody Civil War, and yes, the king losing his head, is undeniable, the focus on bourgeois revolution requires us to look at the immediate beneficiaries, and maybe more importantly, those who were frankly betrayed. While Oliver Cromwell was certainly the outstanding leader required for the parliamentary victory, his actions quite quickly demonstrated a counter-revolutionary tendency in the later stages. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the change was a full social revolution when the most advanced thinkers and fighters were so quickly defeated. I am thinking specifically of the levelers here. These were men, often common soldiers, who demanded genuine social change, universal male suffrage, Well, for property owners, admittedly, but still radical for the time, legal reform, religious tolerance, popular sovereignty. They believed they were fighting for the people. Yet, in 1649, Cromwell and the New Model Army leadership executed the levelers' leaders, such as at Burford. These men fought against Cromwell precisely because they felt he was, well, betraying the ideals of what the Civil War had been about. This rapid defeat of these radical elements suggests the change was more a realignment of elite political and economic power, perhaps, but certainly not a comprehensive, people-led social revolution.
However, to focus exclusively on that betrayal, I think, is to miss the fundamental systemic changes that were secured. The source material explicitly calls Cromwell the Lenin of the English bourgeois revolution, and while, okay, that analogy is loaded, it arguably provides the most illuminating explanation for the fundamental outcome. The system of governance and economic organization was shifted away from absolutism forever.
The Lenin comparison is provocative, yes, but doesn't it imply a successful restructuring of the state for a new class? How can that really be true when the proletariat of that moment, the popular democratic movement, the levelers, were immediately executed? I mean, Lenin, or any successful revolutionary leader, consolidates power for the new ruling class, often ruthlessly, yes. But Cromwell consolidated power by immediately suppressing the very democratic demands that inspired many of the common fighters. It seems to me that the speed with which the new regime executed the levelers demonstrates that the mighty struggle of social forces was actually curtailed before achieving truly revolutionary scope. The immediate beneficiaries were not the common people. They were the landed gentry and commercial interests who secured property rights and parliamentary supremacy. The revolution, if we insist on calling it that, swiftly devoured its own children, didn't it? Which indicates a deep instability and perhaps a narrowness in its ultimate aims.
Well, I would argue that this tension, the suppression of the, let's call it the ultra-left, is often an inherent, maybe even stabilizing feature of the bourgeois revolution. You arguably cannot achieve the necessary political and economic consolidation if you allow the most radical elements to create immediate social chaos. If we reduce the conflict to merely an English Civil War, we diminish the fact that the entire legal and political infrastructure, not just the monarch, was challenged and for a time overthrown. We must also look beyond the purely English-centric view for a moment, even if we accept the revolution framing. The very structure of the state was permanently altered. Parliamentarians, even before the regicide, implemented unprecedented mechanisms for financing the war, reorganized taxation, and effectively created a cohesive economic zone favoring national trade and naval power. These were systemic, revolutionary changes in the architecture of the state, not just temporary adjustments to a civil conflict.
I agree that the changes in state financing and trade policy were profound, but that's a fair reading of the evolution of the state, sure, not necessarily evidence of a successful social revolution. If the ultimate goal was simply to secure parliamentary power and commercial freedom for certain groups, then perhaps civil war suffices, as it highlights the conflict between competing elites for control of the existing state apparatus, albeit a reformed one. And this brings us back to the legacy of Cromwell. You praise him as the indispensable leader who secured the necessary gains, but the very people who fought and bled for Parliament, many of them, saw him as a betrayer. His decision to order the execution of the levelers on May 17, 1649, is a crucial historical marker, isn't it? If we embrace the revolution framework too strongly, we risk kind of justifying his more tyrannical actions, like dissolving the Rump Parliament later on, as necessary for some greater historical good. I'm not fully convinced by that line of reasoning, because it imposes a sort of functionalist historical inevitability that negates the agency and the real importance of the levelers' democratic demands.
I understand the desire to resist that kind of teleology, I do, but the bourgeois revolution as a concept often entails a consolidation of power that necessitates dealing with more radical factions who threaten the core gains secured by the dominant progressive class of that era. Without Cromwell's iron will and, let's face it, political acumen, the revolution arguably would have been betrayed much sooner by the big bourgeoisie seeking an accommodation with the crown, and that would have meant the complete reversal of Parliament's power. His actions, while harsh and certainly tragic for the levelers, arguably secured the gains that led eventually to permanent parliamentary supremacy, the abolition of feudal land tenure, and the eventual rise of modern democracy. He was the critical, outstanding leader required for such an upheaval, precisely because he was willing to make those hard choices to protect the core change from being undone by royalist reaction.
It seems we're debating whether a revolution is defined by the depth of its initial popular intent, perhaps, or by the stability of its eventual, often more conservative outcome. The fact that the entire structure, monarchy, lords, established church, was restored in 1660 suggests that the revolution was at best maybe a temporary republic secured by military force, and that the long-term changes were achieved through painful, slow political evolution following the Civil War, rather than being cemented in 49.
But that historical instability and the very necessity of using the revolution label today is precisely because the rulers of Britain has spent centuries trying to dissolve the memory of this event into a comforting narrative of gradualness. That's the point. They aim to create the myth that progress is achieved only through small, safe steps and reforms. By labeling it the revolution, we reclaim the truth that fundamental societal change often requires violent, non-linear breaks.
That's an excellent point regarding the historical cover-up, which I absolutely accept. The present crisis in Britain, as the source material notes, does indeed seem to be upsetting those old comforting illusions about smooth progress. And historians are, as you say, rediscovering the fact that massive change often requires massive upheaval. However, the fact that this truth is often concealed under, well, falsehoods does not automatically validate the term revolution as the most accurate analytical framework for that specific period, 1642-49. If we look at the immediate aftermath, the political compromises that followed, the continued maneuvering, things like the Act of Union in 1707, we see a continued, complex process of elite maneuvers and parliamentarian consolidation. We must be cautious, I think, not to replace the myth of gradualism with an overly simplified, maybe predetermined historical model, the monolithic, successful revolution. The complexity of the outcomes, including the betrayal of those who fought in the field, pushes me toward viewing it as a civil war with revolutionary consequences, a period of intense conflict that enabled later structural changes, rather than a successful, completed social revolution between 1642 and 1649 itself.
I have to disagree on the characterization of the consequences being merely enabled. I believe they were enacted. The social forces unleashed, however curtailed later, led directly to the king losing his head and the establishment of a republic, however temporary it turned out to be. We must understand the 17th century events as a violent, decisive English revolution that installed the foundations of modern democracy, albeit a democracy initially reserved for the propertied class. The struggle of social forces within this period is the most significant takeaway for understanding British history and, frankly, the often violent nature of state formation.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the label revolution fully captures the complexity without significant qualification. While the events were undeniably transformative and bloody, we must remember the rapid suppression of radical democratic elements like the levelers. This highlights the nuanced and often curtailed nature of the social changes actually achieved by 1649. The political outcome was profound, yes, but the promised social reshaping was, it seems, quickly abandoned by the very leaders who instigated the change.
And yet it shattered the divine right of kings forever. That rupture in legitimacy, that surely is the definition of revolution.
Which is a political and legal transformation, yes, that secured the power of one economic elite over another, but not necessarily a foundational social shift for the vast majority of the population at that time.
Precisely why the true struggle, the social and economic realignment, must be found within the ecclesiastical and political shells of the conflict.
Indeed, the period of 1642 to 1649 remains one of the most turbulent and fascinating in British history, and the source material certainly demands a careful study of whether its profound impact should be framed by the concept of revolutionary necessity, the violent but necessary restructuring of society, or by a more detailed analysis of the Civil War's specific political outcomes and the subsequent betrayals and compromises. Both lenses, clearly, reveal critical truths about the origins of the modern state. There is clearly much more to explore in this crucial material.